Father, I pray that you would open up our ears, open up our eyes, open up our hearts and souls to you to receive your word this morning in Jesus' name. Genesis 11, look at verse 31 and 32. Now, before I read these, we have, and you see this in the New Testament, Paul says this, he addresses this, where he says, and he points out, that God told Abram, this is before God changed his name to Abraham, so Abram. If you hear me say Abraham or Abram, I'm speaking about the same person. But he tells Abraham, get out of Ur of the Chaldees, out of your own country and all that, and go to a land that I tell you. But we really see how it really played out in Genesis 11 and 12. In Genesis 11, verse 31, it says, Terah, the son of Abraham, took his son. Terah took his son Abraham. See, my mind was already on something else. And his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. They came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, if you were to look at a map, let me see if I can kind of imagine a map of the Middle East, Israel, between Israel and what we know as modern day, was that Iran or Iraq? Iran, I believe it is. Anyways, so Ur of the Chaldees would be here, Israel here, Mediterranean Sea over here, and you have the Euphrates River, Tigris River, and all that. So they left Ur of the Chaldees, went way up north to a place called Haran. Actually, in the Hebrew, it's Haran. And there's the son of Terah, that is actually Haran. In our English Bibles, they're both spelled the same, but in the Hebrew, they're not. One's a and one's a. So, and then Terah, the father of Abram, dies in Haran. Okay? Then we pick up the story in chapter 12. Go to chapter 12, verse 1. It says, Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Now remember, this is in Haran. Okay? So when we read in other places that God told Abraham to get out of Ur of the Chaldees, I'm not saying God didn't speak to Abram in Ur of the Chaldees in their original homeland, but nonetheless it was still Terah, Abram's father, that was responsible for leaving Ur of the Chaldees. Now this is extremely important to understand, and where I'm going to go with this, so keep your mind on that. So he says, get out of your country, from your family and your father's house, to a land I will show you. So at this point he didn't even tell him where he was taking him. Okay? And sometimes we want, or I shouldn't even say sometimes, most all the time, we want God to tell us straight up, what is my future, Lord? Give me an image of everything I'm going to be and everything I'm going to do. And rarely he does. He just says, just follow me and I'll show you where we're going as we go. So he says, get out of your country, away from your family and your father's house, to a land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now again, this happens in Haran. Terah, Abram's father, was responsible for getting Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees. He got about halfway through his journey and he dies. Now God speaks to Abram in Haran, halfway on the way to Canaan. When I say halfway, I don't necessarily mean halfway if you drew a straight line, but the trip goes way up north and then comes back down south into the place where he's supposed to be. So if you just drew a straight line, I don't know where they would be, it doesn't matter. But so they had to go, because the reason they did that is they followed the river, so they'd always have water. They followed the Euphrates, Tigris, and all that up north to where there's a riverhead, and then they followed it down south where they would eventually pick it up at the Jordan River. So they always had water. So now it was in Haran again that Abram was instructed by God, get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to the land I will show you. Abram had to finish. Now here's the key on this part. Abram had to finish what his father had begun. All right? Now, his natural father. There was a trip. Now, so let's imagine this in both sense. Let's say God did not speak to Abram while in Ur of the Chaldees, but his father started the trip anyways. Abram had to finish what his father started. Or assume that God did speak to Abram and told him in Ur of the Chaldees and says, now get out of your family's house, get out of all that, your father's house, go to this place I'm going to show you. And he convinces his father to go with him. Which is highly likely because you'll see in just a moment that Abram has a problem with sticking to family he needs to cut off. And the reason this is important to me, because many of you already have, and some of you still will, deal with this same issue. Because family has a way of guilting you into believing in some false connection that God never created. How many of you felt that guilt? Yeah. How many of you are dealing it right now? Don't show it. Don't. That was just, Now, why do I point this out? It doesn't mean that you just flippantly one day like your family and the next day you don't like your family. You obey the voice of God completely. Now, the word to Abram was, leave your family, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house. How many of you are married? You can go ahead and raise your hand on this. It's not a trick question. Okay, you're married. All right, okay. Are we married? She's like, are we married?
Check it.
Is that rock real? Anyways, where was I? Okay, you guys remember what the Bible says about being married. You shall leave your mother and father. Does anybody you all understand what the word leave means? Right? Leave your mother and father and cleave to your wife, for the two shall become one. Right? Do you know, once you are married, your spouse is your number one. Your mommy, your daddy is no longer your problem. Now, before you're married, that's a whole other issue. This is why I said a few weeks ago, moms, dads, stop living through your children, especially your married children. Leave them alone. Get out of their business and stay out. Well, they're having problems, then they need me. No, they don't. You're probably the problem. No, I'm going to be honest with you. Moms, dads, if you feel like your married children need you, you are the problem. Because if you haven't instilled in them, by the time they're married, if you haven't put in them what they need to really be married, you failed. That's not cold, that's truth. That's just truth. My son Mike's, hey, Dad, I need something. No, you don't. You married. Click. No, I don't do that. Now, don't get me wrong. Family is still there to help one another. But the problem, what I see with a lot of parents is, oh, I hear that my son or my daughter is having a problem. I have to go to them. Did they invite you? Well, no, but they're my daughter. I can't. They're my son. It's like, stay out of their business. And I'm telling you, listen, he's just being mean. No, I'm being biblical. Let them grow up and be the adults. I mean, adults are supposed to be married, not children. So if you gave your son and daughter in marriage, you said they're adults, now stay out of their business. Anyways, all the young people went, yes. Anyways, it doesn't mean your parents will listen. I'm sorry. It's just they won't. And they're all angry at me right now, especially if they hear me in this room, whatever. They're angry at me anyways. I get blamed from people I don't even meet. I meet people, oh, you're that preacher. Yeah, I'm that preacher. Anyways, what preacher? Do I know you? So anyways, let's go back to this. So it was while in Haran that we see at least this portion of the instruction. We don't know fully if it really actually happened as well in Ur, or if the whole story is just kind of, because it's not real super clear in that sense, But we do know at least in Haran, God says to Abram, maybe the first time, maybe the second time, now get out of your father's house. And then let's pick up the story. Where do we go? Oh, no, I don't want to pick up the story there just yet. So I want you to think about this. Abram was called to finish what Terah, his father, had started. Now this is where I do want to ask you. This isn't for you to shout out, just to think. What is it, whether your parents, your fathers, especially your father, your natural father, was saved or not really the issue. Because Terah he raised his family in a pagan land with foreign gods. And it wasn't until God, the true God, revealed himself to Abram that he didn't even know. Now maybe he had heard, but he would have been just thrown into one of the many gods in that system. Okay? So now he's being revealed as the one true God to Abram, not Terah. So Abram was called and asked to finish what his pagan father began. Okay? So when I say that, I'm not telling you like only those, if you had super righteous parents. If your mother, family had a business, have a business, or had a business, whether they were right or wrong, you are to finish what they began. In my own family, many of us, like my generation, are very, we're, construction guys. We could build things. We can build almost anything. But when you do, and I don't know my family history way back, but I do know enough that construction has always been in our blood. So just growing up and watching my dad and my uncles, my grandfather do these types of things, it was just a natural thing for me. In other words, to a degree at least, I haven't started a business, I am finishing what they began to a degree. There's that natural thing that's just kind of a flow in the family. But there's some of you in here that you are supposed to finish what your fathers began in the area of business. Maybe they started a business, I don't know what business, any business, and it's your turn to finish what they began. Some of you have ministry in your background, and you're not in ministry. I'm telling you, you're to finish what they began. Now, what does that mean exactly? I'm not saying go and stop everything, go to Bible college and start a church, but I'm saying that there's some aspect of ministry that you are to finish that they began. So if you can kind of keep that in mind, think about this. Let's talk about just the fathers in the faith, since we're in a church. Look at the Azusa Street revival and ministry of William Seymour about 100 years ago, 110 years ago, or 12 years ago at this point. Since then, almost every year they have like Azusa 2015, and it's nothing compared to the Azusa of 1906. Azusa 2017, and it's nothing compared to what we read about that came out in 1906 in that era. Somebody has to stand up and say, no, I'm going to bring the real Azusa. That's my spiritual father, the father in the faith, and we're going to start where he ended, where that's going to be our starting place, and we're going to finish what he began. How about the miracle and power ministry of Smith Wigglesworth? Who's going to see him and recognize him as their spiritual father and finish what he began? Or for you ladies want some too? Don't have any. So anyways, just kidding. How about the miracle and power ministries of Catherine Kuhlman, Amy Semple McPherson, Mariah Woodworth Eder? How about the power and authority or the governmental ministry of Alexander Dewey, who controlled the Chicago area by the Spirit in the late 1800s, early 1900s? They tried to blow him up. His office. They rigged a bomb in his office so that when he opened the door, his office would blow up. He turned the knob, opened the door, the office blew up. Everything around him was destroyed, and he was left with just the knob in his hand, and he was perfectly fine. It's the kind of power these guys walked in. But who's going to pick that up and say, I'm going to walk in that kind of a power? Who's going to walk in or pick up the power and the healing ministries of people such as Jack Coe, A.A. Allen, Oral Roberts, T.L. Osborne, etc., 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 etc. We can go on. My point is, we are not seeing these great powers in the earth because people are not wanting to finish what their fathers had started. You see, just as Terah had to get his whole family packed up, provide provisions, make sure they were all ready, the donkeys and the mules and the camels and the horses or whatever they took with them, the livestock for the journey, the kids, the women, the sons, the daughters, they had to prepare all of them and make sure they're all prepared for this trip and start walking and keep people motivated, because I don't know about you, walking about 1,000 miles is very frustrating. Okay? I love to backpack, but I'm also that lazy backpacker. You know, every quarter of a mile, I'm sitting on the ground taking a rest, eating my trail mix. By the time I get through the first day, all my food's gone. You know, I haven't really planned very well and everything like that. Now, I love being in the outdoors and everything, but I'm, you know, because I'm more impatient than anything. It's like, what's around that next one? What's around? You know, are we there yet? Are we yet? I mean, you talk about like a little 4-year. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there? We've only down a quarter of a mile. We got 20 more miles to go. What? So, yeah, wilderness wanderings. I would have definitely been there with Caleb simply because I hate wandering around. You know. So, not because I was super spiritual, because I ain't going to wander around with these people. I'm like a quarter of a mile. Can we slaughter a sheep? I'm hungry. You know, come on, let's go. So, anyways, but just as Terah had to do these things in preparation, Abram had to do the exact same thing now. Okay? Just as all these fathers and mothers in the faith had to do their preparation, we have to do the same type of preparation. And do you know one thing that I know ties them all together? A common thread through all of their ministries? Prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting. So who will finish it? I'm throwing this out to you, and that's not even really the meat of my message, because I preached a message on this talking about fathers and who will finish their things. But what is the call? What was the call on your father's life? And when I say father, your natural father, spiritual father, and fathers in the faith. Maybe people you've never met directly, but you know that you connect with them somehow, like the William Seymours, the A.A. Allens, and the Wigglesworths and such. Was it business, politics, ministry? What aspect of politics? What aspect of ministry? What aspect of business? Now go out and finish it. Now, I'm not just saying just because your father, let's say, was a police officer, you automatically have to be a police officer. That's not what I'm saying. But you really need to pray and say, God, what portion of my father's, natural or otherwise, life do I need to pick up and run with? Because God is right now looking for people that are going to run with it. And this year, it's not going to be the only this year, but this year is going to be the beginning of something powerful for not just this church, but the church in the earth and the earth itself, because many things are going to be begun in 2018 that's going to have eternal impact. I'm not going to say it's all going to be finished, because we're literally going to take some of these things into eternity, but it's going to be begun this year. And some have already begun and have been struggling and fighting and wondering if it's even worth staying in that place, doing that thing. You know, like I'm sure Abram, after he got to Haran and his father dies, is sitting there twiddling his thumbs going, maybe we shouldn't have left, maybe we messed up, I don't know what's going on, until God speaks. Let this be as the voice of God to you right now. This year's when it's going to start making sense and really taking off. Even those things that you established before that didn't seem like to have much speed or much leg to it, this year is going to start taking off. Beauty for Ashes this year is going to start really taking off. It was very wise of you, whether you knew it by the Spirit or not, but very wise of you guys to already have everything established, so now you don't have to worry about that. You can just run. Okay? Anyways, now look at verse 4. Now we're going to start getting good. Oh yeah, I just want to make a point with these two verses. Verse 4 actually. It says, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. Notice he departed as the Lord had spoken to him, but he didn't do everything as the Lord spoke to him, because Lot went with him. He said, get away from your family. And he takes family with him. And if you know the story of Abraham and Lot, later on, Lot becomes a problem to him. He keeps having to bail out Lot and take care of him. Lot's a little self-centered. When the land was not enough for all the blessings that God gave Abram and all the blessings that God gave Lot, because he was, and it says, because he was with Abram says, listen, it's not, I don't want to fight with you. I don't want my guys fighting with your guys. You pick where you want to go, and you can have that, and I'll go the other way. And Lot picks the best. He has no heart. He doesn't even understand where his blessings really come from, his connection to his uncle Abraham. And you guys can call him Uncle Abraham. Uncle Abraham. And he takes the best. Instead of honoring his uncle, the elder and uncle, the reason of his blessing, and saying, no, you take the best and I'll go the other way. He looks around and goes, yep, that's the best, I'll take it. And then gets in a lot of trouble in Sodom and Gomorrah and loses absolutely everything. And yet God still blesses Abram. Anyway, so that's just, now drop down to verse 6. Now we're really getting to the good part. Shechem. Everybody say Shechem. Shechem. No, that's not a nasty word. It's just, you can, if somebody's, if you want to go cuss at somebody, just say Shechem, It's not a bad word at all. It just sounds like it could be if you say it right. Anyways, Genesis 12, 6 through 7. We're always trying to look for those little loopholes, 6 and 7. It says, Abram passed through the land. Now remember, he's on his way from Haran. He's headed south. He says, pass through the land to Shechem, to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Morah. And the Canaanites were in the land. Those are the bad guys. And the Lord appeared to Abraham. Now he gets to Shechem. Now this is important. He gets to Shechem as far as, now Shechem is an area, to Morah, where the terebinth tree is. And then there, the Lord appears. So in verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So think about this. Whether it was in Ur or Haran or both places, God speaks to Abram to get the journey going. Once in the land, and Shechem is pretty much, I'm not going to say the heart, but close to it, like right in the middle of the land that God's promising him. Now God appears to him. Doesn't just speak, he appears and speaks to him. And then it's at that place that Abram builds an altar to the Lord. An altar is a place of worship, a place to meet God. I almost told you to turn to page 3. I'm the only one with the paper. Now the word Shechem, now this is interesting. The word Shechem is an interesting word. It literally means back or shoulder. Your shoulder or your back. But it also means, it has a lesser meaning, but it also means to rise early or make an early start. Okay, now this is going to be good. Okay, this is going to be good. Okay, so keep that in mind. So the first place that is mentioned where Abram makes his camp is Shechem. After he leaves Haran, he comes down to Shechem, the place of back, shoulder, or early start. And it's in the place of Shechem at Morah. And the word Morah, where's Morah? Oh, this is an interesting word too. It means early rain or teacher, or a teacher of righteousness. So he's at the place of shoulder back, work, rising early, early start. Now remember, he's at Shechem. Okay, the place is Shechem. And he's at Morah in Shechem. And so he's at the place where shoulder back, that gives an idea or the image of work, carrying something. As a matter of fact, what's interesting, and you don't have to turn there, you can write this down, look at it later. In 1 Chronicles 15:15, it says, the children of the Levites bore the ark of God, which represents the presence of God, on their shoulders. In Numbers 7:9, it says, sons of Kohath he gave none, because theirs was the service of the holy things, which they carried on their shoulders. So the presence of God and the holy things of God was to be carried on the shoulders. Where are they at? The place of the shoulder. Rising early, in other words, it's an image of work, but the work is carrying the presence of God and the holy things of God. more specifically at the place of the early rain or righteous teacher. So listen, he comes to this place that's completely, profoundly holy for him, Abram. And God meets him. Where does he meet him? At the place where he's carrying God's presence. God meets him at the place where Abram carries God's presence, and at the place of the early rain. Now, the early rain was the rain that would come to the land before they would sow. It would break up the land and water the land, so when they sowed the seed, the land was prepared. Otherwise, if they did not get the early rain when it was supposed to come, the ground, because remember, it's desert, would be hard and dusty, and no seed would grow, meaning there would be no harvest later. So the early rain was needed. Okay, so he's at this place specifically of righteous teaching and early rain, meaning this is a place where he is being taught of the Lord, righteous teacher, and being prepared for his future, the planting of the seed for a future harvest, because he's carrying the presence of God. Sorry, I have this little song going on in my head. I hate being in those elevators and your jam comes on and nobody's in there and you're like jamming and the doors go. You know, Barry Manilow just moves me. Anyways, elevator music, guys. Come on, it's an elevator. You're in there, oh, Mandy, will you kiss me? You're just crying. Oh. You don't even know who Mandy is, but you want to kiss her. Anyways, see, I said that when my wife's gone. Where is she? Anyway, so where was I? So, Shechem is not a place of complacency. It's a picture of carrying the presence of God, the holy things of the Lord on the shoulder, as the ark was carried on the shoulders. Shechem is not a place, now listen to this. Hear this. Shechem is not a place of seeking God. It's not a place of seeking God. When you come to your Shechem, you've already been found by God, because that's where God appeared to Abram. Then he built an altar. It's a place God finds you. You don't find God. How do you get to your Shechem? You will be obedient when he says, get out of here. Listen, can adult children who have a problem with getting away from mommy and daddy have a hard time finding God? Why? Mommy and daddy is in the way. That is good. That'll preach, but that's another time. Okay, now let me go on. So he's there. Now remember in verse 7, God appears to Abram, and then Abram builds an altar. Remember that pattern. God appears, then he builds an altar. Let's look at verse 8 and 9. Because I don't think this was very smart. God's meeting with you. Things are going great. You're being taught of the Lord. There's preparation for a great harvest coming later. You know, all these wonderful things are happening at Shechem. And then in verse 8 he says, he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel. He pitched his tent with Bethel on the west. Where are we? Is this the west? I think this way, if I'm facing right. Or is it this way? It doesn't matter. So on the west, and Ai on the east. There, now listen, there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still towards the south. Okay? He leaves Shechem, where God appears to him. Then he builds an altar and plants his camp, sets his camp between Bethel, which means the house of God. Now look at this. This is important. Sometimes words, title, meaning like really means something prophetically as it's speaking to us even right now. So he leaves Shechem, where God's meeting with him and blessing him and teaching him and training him, and he's got the presence of the Lord on him, and everything's going good. He comes and sets his camp between the house of God and Ai, which, listen to this, means a heap of ruin. A heap of ruin. So he sets camp between God's house and destruction. Then he builds an altar to the Lord and calls on the name of the Lord. But you'll notice in that verse, God never answers. So many times we get between things and not fully committed and expect God still to speak to us as if we were still at Shechem. But he couldn't even commit to Bethel, the house of God. He built his camp between the house of God, which is God's presence, where he lives, where he dwells, where you can meet with God, and ruin. And I've seen too many Christians in that situation, where they build their life between the presence of the Lord and ruin. I don't know about you, but that was good stuff right there. Yeah, that was honest. That was just really, it was phenomenal. And that's the word of the Lord. Now this again is a picture of not being completely devoted to God. Abram didn't go completely into Bethel, the house of God, but was near it. On account of this, he was also close to ruin. How many Christians, are just people who claim to love Jesus or know Jesus or believe in Jesus that have not committed to being at church, whether this church or any church? Do you know how close to ruin they really actually are? So close that they're actually experiencing Ai more than Bethel and don't even realize it. And I've known people that have even tried to prophesy, yet they don't go to church. And guess how much of their prophecy I listen to? 0. But they could be anointed. They can anoint themselves right on out of here. Commit yourself to God. Abram tried to hear God's voice, set up an altar, called on his name, and it doesn't even say God answered him in that place. Why? He was uncommitted. What does Jesus say about being lukewarm? He wants you hot, he wants you cold, he don't want you in the middle. God did not tell him to go to the middle of his house, between his house and a place of ruin. Now, and what's interesting about this after that is, check this out. Let me turn the page. Look at verse 10. Now remember, he moves from Haran to Shechem. God meets with him. Everything's going great. For some reason, he moves from Shechem to between Bethel and Ai. Sets up an altar trying to duplicate what happened in Shechem, and he can't. Then in verse 10 it says, now there was famine in the land. Now there was famine in the land. And Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. Didn't go back to the place where God met him and he was being blessed. He went further south into Egypt. Now, the word Egypt I thought was kind of interesting, because when you think of, say, the word, or think of the word in the original language, Egypt, you would assume it's Egypt. I thought so. And it's not. It's a word that's... I'm going to try to say this in Hebrew. Mitzrayim. That's Egypt. The translators just give it the modern name instead of the real name that God said. It's Mitzrayim. Now here, let me read a little bit out of an article by the gentleman named Jeff A. Benner on this word. It says, the name Mitzrayim can be interpreted, remember Egypt, Mitzrayim, can be interpreted many ways, or many different ways. The basic name Egypt or Mitzrayim means double straits. Okay, straits, like an impression in the ground. All right? Possibly referring to the two sides of the Nile River, double straits, or two enemies, or double pressing, because that's what it really means, a pressing in, double, two enemies, double pressing, or even double trouble. While we cannot determine for certain what this name originally meant, it's in that ballpark, we can see some interesting parallels between Egypt and their relationship with the nation Israel. You guys know the rest of the story about Egypt and Israel. It was a place of blessing that turned into a place of bondage. Where is Abraham now running to? The future place of bondage for his people, instead of back to Shechem where the presence of God was. Because he tried to duplicate Shechem between the house of God and a heap of ruin. And it's so unfortunate. Now, why am I sharing this with you guys on the verge of 2018? Now, let me read some comparisons real quick to you. I already made them, but I want to put it in a kind of a nutshell real quick. Here's a comparison. Shechem, carrying God's presence, working with or for the Lord, but carrying his presence, not looking for God, already having him, being found by him. Place of righteous teaching, place of early rain or the preparation for the future. Then you compare that with the place between Bethel and Ai, the house of God, between. Now, I have to say this, between. And when I say the house of God, I'm not talking about just a local church. I'm talking about the place where God is. Remember Jacob later at Bethel. He meets with God. Abram was just if you will, I don't know the distance between there, and he was in between, but he wasn't far from the place that his grandson would meet God in a powerful way. He was that close. So he was between Bethel and ruin. And doesn't that sound like many people today? And they don't even realize it. They can set up their altars, call on the Lord. They can praise. They can worship. But God isn't speaking to them at that place. They can go through all the religious nonsense, and God's not anywhere to be found. Why? Because he's back at Shechem, or he's in his own house. He's not in between somewhere. And there's too many believers that want to live in the in-between and think they're still going to be blessed by God. And what ends up happening, just as with Abram, sorry, I threw you and Ahab together. Abram, famine sets in. What is famine? Remember, famine is no water, no food. No food means no word. There's no strong word. God wasn't speaking to him there. There was no food, spiritually speaking. There was no water. That means water is an indication of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit of God wasn't in that place. Do you know why? God is committed, not in a place in between somewhere. If it would have been better for Abram to go pitch his tent at Ai, the heap of destruction, because that would have been like being cold. That would have been like coming over to this place of like, God, I'm miserable, I'm messed up, where are you? And God could meet him there. But being in between and then acting like everything's fine and trying to create your own sense of what is religious and what looks good. Remember, he built his altar before God spoke to him. But in Shechem, God spoke to him, appeared to him, then he built an altar. So he's trying to duplicate what he had, and it couldn't be duplicated. He was trying to be fed on the word of the Lord, and God wasn't speaking. He was looking for the presence of the Holy Spirit and being refreshed by the water of his presence, and it wasn't to be around because why? Famine was set in. Instead of going back to Shechem where he was meeting with God, carrying God, and having that relationship with God, he goes down to Egypt. He goes to a place of double trouble. He goes to the place of two enemies. He goes to the place of being pressed in an unrighteous manner. Now, why is this so important for us today? I feel like as they would say, preaching to the choir. And in a big way I am. Because in 2018, great things are going to be happening. Great and phenomenal things are going to be happening. I can't even put to words what I'm sensing for this year. But it's also a year that we need to be committed. We can't be between two decisions. We can't be outside of Bethel, our Bethel. We can't be outside of our Shechem. We can't be setting up our own altars when God's not speaking. We can't afford that. I'm not saying you still won't be blessed on some level. I'm saying that blessing will be lost in the famine if you don't. I'm not saying there's going to be a physical famine come to the land. I'm saying there's going to be a famine of the spirit of those who cannot commit to one or the other. They cannot be found in the place where God is at. And Abram, unfortunately, had this problem where he couldn't break away from family. He couldn't break away. He was obedient, but not fully. And it always cost him. Like God says later on, hey, I'm going to bring about an heir from your loins. And the next thing you know, he's making Ishmael, doing it incorrectly, doing it his way, actually his wife's way, doing it incorrectly, not following through fully on the promise of God. And God let him do it. He didn't stop him. But then he says, no, you don't understand. He's not the one. I'm still going to bring out another. And it's like, oi, I made a mistake. Yeah, you did. Because God is looking for us not to be in between two decisions. He is saying, make up your mind. What are you going to be? I don't want you in between. I want you fully serving me. When I tell you to get out of Ur the Chaldees and go to the, he says, I'll show you. But Canaan land, when you're in Canaan land, stop. And he ended up in Egypt. Why? Because when you're disobedient, famine sets in. When you're not fully obedient, famine sets in. I'm not saying you're going to come home, your cupboards are going to be bare. But in the spirit, there will be no word. God will not be speaking to you. You'll pray. You'll do all the religious things. You'll come to church and you'll worship. And you'll go out just as dry as when you came in. And did you notice that much, not all, but much of this up to this problem, up to this issue, was because of his relationship with his family, that God said, leave them. And he takes Lot with him. Sometimes he's on, sometimes he's off. Just like his relationship and his obedience to God in regard to his family, no wonder he was found between the house or the presence of the God and ruin. See, a lot of times we think, well, I'm pretty close to God. You're also just as close to destruction. And if you're just pretty close to God, who's going to win eventually? Destruction. How do we know that destruction won? Now he's in Egypt because of the famine. He has to rely on what becomes his enemies to sustain his life, not God. How far do we have to fall before we realize these things? I want to keep you from that place. I'm telling you, it's going to be difficult sometimes not receiving the blessing, but being fully obedient to the Lord. But this year, be fully obedient to the Lord, because it's like what Jesus says. What is it if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? Now, please, I'm not saying anybody's going to lose their salvation in here. That's not what I'm saying. But just because you have financial blessing or blessing out here doesn't mean you have that inner blessing of a right relationship with the Lord. I want you to have both, because both are going to be needed, because it's going to be in that place of great obedience to the presence of the Lord that we're not only going to have his voice speaking to us clearly and more clearly, but then you're going to be able to take the blessing of the Lord and multiply it all the more. Why? Because we're truly in a place of the early rain, and we're being taught righteously of his Spirit. We're going to know what to do with the blessing that God gives us. Now, last week I spoke about grasshopper mentality, and I know I kind of went backwards about 400 years, but it's all in the same thing. Why did they have grasshopper mentality? Because they didn't fully believe God. They believed God enough to leave Egypt, but they didn't believe God enough to go into the promise. Abram, it seems to be a problem with that culture. He believed God enough to get out of Ur and Haran, but didn't believe God enough to stay in his presence at a place such as Shechem. We can't be that way. We're either all the way in or we're all the way out. You try to live in between. Stop it. Try to live in between, and you'll end up in famine. 2018, I'm telling you, is going to be a phenomenal year. Phenomenal year. But it's going to be a phenomenal year. Thank you. It's going to be a phenomenal year because we're fully committed to the Lord and what he says.